on Yudchet Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the top. The Mishnah said that you can't put kelim in a mikvah on Shabbat or on Yom Tov. And the Gemara is trying to explain why this is. The first attempt to explain it is that it's a gzera that you might wind up carrying those kelim in a Rishut Rabin. So Hatenach Shabbat biyom tov ma'ikar memar. That explains why you wouldn't be able to do it on Shabbat, but on Yom Tov you're allowed to carry. So why would it be also on Yom Tov? The Gemara says Gzera Yom Tov atu Shabbat. If you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov, you're going to wind up doing it on Shabbat too. Umi Gazrinan, the Gemara asks, do we make such a Gzera? And Rashi explains, Umi Gazrinan umi achmur Rabbanan kulei hai behach takanta ditfilat kelim lemigzar hetera atorisura ve'ugzera legzera. The Gemara doesn't ask specifically about the idea of making a Gzera about Shabbat. About Yom Tov, that you might come to do something on Shabbat. According to Rashi, the question is more general. Is putting kelim in a mikvah so strict that you need to make a bunch of additional gzerot to protect that? And we're going to see a series of cases where the Gemara says that if it's so strict, you should have made a gzera in this case too. So, v'hatanan v'shavin shemashikin et hamayim bekli even et haran, aval lo matbilin. We said in the Mishnah that you can, if you have water that was drawn and became tameh, you're allowed to lower it back into a you're allowed to lower it back into a water source in order to touch the water you drew previously to groundwater, because groundwater can't become tameh. And as soon as you touch other water to groundwater, that water that you touch to it also is no longer tameh. So you're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to actually put the pitcher or whatever it was in the mikvah. BEITZA, if it's true that putting kelim in the mikvah is so strict, nigzor hashaka atu hatbala. We should make a gzera that you're not allowed to do this hashaka, that you're not allowed to touch the previously drawn water to groundwater, in order to prevent you from putting the entire pitcher in a mikveh. V'tisbera, is that reasonable? If he has a source of fresh water, then he has no reason to take the water he drew that became tameh and do hashaka. He can just draw more water. And it must be that he doesn't have any source of fresh water. Since he doesn't have any new fresh water, he only has this fresh water that he already drew. He's going to be careful with it that it shouldn't become tameh. And if he's so careful with it, then it's not very likely that it's going to become tameh. It's a mita de la shchicha or mita de la shchicha lagazur be'rabanan. Etive madlin bili tameh v'hu tahor. The Gemara says you're allowed to draw water with a tameh bucket from a spring or whatever, and by the fact that you put that tameh bucket in the spring, it becomes tahor. Which, as you might notice, is very similar to putting a kli in a mikvah. And if putting kelim in a mikvah is in fact so strict, then we should make a gzera that you can't do this in order to prevent you from just putting any tameh bucket in a mikvah. Shanei hatam mitoch shelo utra lo ela al yedei dalyo zachuru. So the Gemara says that particular case is different. That's a very, shall we say, localized heter, in a case where he happens to be drawing the water anyways. Since it's only permitted in a case where he's drawing the water anyways, he's going to remember that he can't just take any tamei kli and put it in a mikvah. Etive kli shenitma me'erev yom tov ein matbilin oto biyom tov matbilin oto biyom tov v'im ita nigzor diyom tov atu de'erev yom tov. So the Gemara says, if you have some kind of utensil that became tamei before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to put it in a mikvah on Yom Tov. But if it became tamei on Yom Tov, you're allowed to put it in a mikvah on Yom Tov. If so, then the Mishnah, the previous Mishnah apparently refers only to stuff that became tamei before Yom Tov. But if it's true that, if it's true that putting kelim in a mikvah is so strict that we should make a gzera Yom Tov atu Shabbat, then by the same token, we should make a gzera that stuff that became tamei on Yom Tov should not be put in a mikvah, because you might come to take stuff that became tamei before Yom Tov and also put that in a mikvah. And the Gemara answers, Milta tum'a b'Yom Tov milta de la shchicha hi, u milta de la shchicha la gazru b'harabanan. And the Gemara says, on Yom Tov, because everyone's assembling at the Beit HaMikdash, they're eating korbanot, people are very careful not to become tamei. So for something to become tamei on Yom Tov is rather uncommon, and we don't make gzerot about an uncommon case. Hang on a second. Etive kli shenitma be'av hatum'ah ein matbilin oto b'yom tov bivlal hatum'ah matbilin oto b'yom tov v'im ita nigzor ha atuha. So most of you are familiar with the Av HaTum'ah versus Vlad HaTum'ah. Av HaTum'ah refers to a sheretz itself, or a Metzorah himself, or a Tamei mate who directly touched the mate, or any of a number of other cases. And Midoraita, an Av HaTum'ah can cause Tum'ah to other people when he touches them, or to Kelim when he touches them. Vlad HaTum'ah would be a person or utensil that touched an Av HaTum'ah, also known in other places as a Rishon Tum'ah, and that is not mitamei doraita, and not mitamei people or utensils midoraita, but it is mitamei midrabanan. So the Gemara quotes a Tosefta that says that if you have a utensil that became tamei by touching an Av HaTum'ah, you can't put it in a mikvah on Yom Tov. But if it touched a Vlad HaTum'ah, you are allowed to put it in a mikvah on Yom Tov. But again, if putting kelim in a mikvah is so strict that we need to make a whole bunch of gezerot to protect it, then we should also make a gezerah that you're not allowed to put kelim in a mikvah even if they were nitma by a Vlad HaTum'ah, in order to make sure that if it became tamei by touching an Av HaTum'ah, you don't put that in a mikvah either. So the Gemara says, Vlad HaTum'ah hechi mashkachat la gabe kohanim zerizim he. The Gemara says, Vlad HaTum'ah hechi mashkachat la mihu hatzarich lahat bilo. The Gemara asks, when do you get a Vlad HaTum'ah? And Rashi clarifies the question. Mihu hatzarich lat bilo. Who needs to take a Vlad HaTum'ah and put that in a mikvah? Eno ela kohen deha Vlad HaTum'ah rishon uchli shenitma bo sheni umutar lechulin she'en sheni oseh shlishi bechulin ve'en tzarich lat bilo ela litruma. Rashi says that the only people who need to be concerned about tum'ah from a Vlad HaTum'ah are kohanim, because a utensil that touched a Vlad HaTum'ah is a sheni tum'ah, and a vessel that touched that touched a Rishon tum'ah cannot make chulin tameh. The only what it can do is make teruma or kodesh tameh, and that's only a concern for kohanim. And kohanim, the Gemara says, kohanim zerizim heim. Kohanim are always careful about tum'ah. So that means that the case of somebody needing to take a vessel that touched a v'rat tum'ah and put it in a mikvah is an uncommon case, and in an uncommon case we don't make gezerot. I could not figure out why this shouldn't be relevant for somebody who is careful to always eat chulin b'tahara, chulin al taharat truma or kodesh or chatat, which are cases that show up in a chagiga. The best I can say is that that's probably not a milta d'shchicha either. Or you could say that somebody who's careful to eat chulin with such a strict level of tahara is obviously also zrizim him. So I'm just gonna read that through in the Gemara again. Vlad hatum'ah hechi mashkachat la gabe kohanim. Kohanim is zrizim him. Tashema damar Rav Chia bar Ashi amar Rav nidash enah begadim ma'aremet vetovelet bivgadeha v'im ita nigzor dilma atilat bule beinayhu. So Rav Chia bar Ashi said in the name of Rav that if you have a nidah who doesn't have any clothing that is tahor, and she needs to go to the mikvah anyways, so she can go to the mikvah in her clothing. Loose clothing is not a chatzitza. At least not midoraita. But if in fact we need to be so strict with putting kelim in a mikvah and make all these gzerot to protect it, then we should also make a gzerah about this, so that she doesn't wind up putting that clothing in a mikvah by itself.
Aren't we worried about spita? It's pretty wet when she comes out.
Okay, so
it's drip drying.
My guess. Okay, so my guess is that the Gemara in Shabbat discusses when we're concerned about schita, when somebody gets clothing wet. And first of all, the Gemara there mentions cases where multiple people are washing at once, and it says in such a case they can use a towel, because they'll remind each other not to squeeze the towel. So it could be that this is restricted to a case where she has a mikvah lady or something around that's going to remind her. Second possibility, I remember seeing the Shulchan Aruch. I don't remember seeing it in the Gemara, although I assume it's in the Gemara, that for tzorech mitzvah somebody is allowed to walk through a river or whatever on Shabbat and doesn't need to be concerned about squeezing their clothing out. So maybe this would also fall into that category of a tzorech mitzvah, that we wouldn't be concerned that somebody who's involved in a mitzvah at the moment is going to forget another mitzvah. So that's those are my guesses. I didn't look into that. Hang on a second. So again, it's similar to the case of the bucket. We say that because we only allowed her to put this clothing in a mikvah by way of wearing it, she's going to remember that she can't put it in a mikvah by itself. Rav Yosef Amar. So we've yeah. Rav Yosef Amar Gzera Mishum Schita. Rav Yosef said that we've now covered the ground of we've now covered the ground of making a gzera about Yom Tov because you might come to do it on Shabbat. We've covered that. The Gemara has not actually refuted that, but it's going to bring some other options as to what the reason why we don't put clothing in, or put any kelim in a mikvah on Yom Tov is. Rav Yosef Amar gezerah mishum schita. You might come to squeeze the clothing out, which is a tolada of melaben. I should just note in parentheses that the schita, squeezing, in the Gemara covers two different things. Schita with things that grow from the ground is a toladav dash. Schita with clothing or absorbent material is a toladav melaben, of whitening or laundering. Amar Aryai tenach kelim de bnei schita ninhu kelim de lav bnei schita ninhu ma'ikar memar. Aryai says that's all right for that explains why you can't put clothing in such a mikvah, but if you put, say, a cup in a mikvah, you're not going to wind up squeezing a cup. So Amar gzera hani atuhane. So Rav Yosef says that they made a gzera about kelim that you can't squeeze, in order to make sure that you don't wind up squeezing the kelim that you are that there is a problem with squeezing. So this brings back the issue we just discussed, the issue of making one gzera to protect another gzera. And so Aryai brought all these proof texts that we just went through, and Rav Yosef gave him all the answers we just went through. Rav Bibi Amar Gezerah Shema Yasheh. Rav Bibi says, why can't you put kelim in a mikvah on Yom Tov? In order to make sure that people don't leave kelim, don't wind up leaving kelim to put in a mikvah specifically on Yom Tov. Rashi says the concern is that if he keeps clothing or dishes or whatever that are tameh around, he might wind up being mitameh other things with them. Another possibility, which I didn't see anywhere, is that we don't want him waiting around. We don't want him taking stuff that he could have done before Yom Tov and waiting until Yom Tov to do it all at once. Because on Yom Tov he has more time on his hands. He can't do any other work. Tanya kevateh de Rav Bibi, kli shenitma me'erev Yom Tov ein matbilin oto b'Yom Tov, gezerah shema yasheh. So we have a braita that supports Rav Bibi. If you have something that became tameh on Erev Yom Tov, you're not allowed to put it in a mikvah on Yom Tov, because if you were allowed to do so, then you might come to leave all your tameh things to put it in a mikvah at once on Yom Tov. Rava says another possible reason why you can't put kelim in a mikvah on Yom Tov. Rava amar mipnei shenir'a ki mitaken kli. It looks like he's fixing something. That is to say, you're taking a kli that previously you couldn't use, or your use of it was limited, and you're restoring it to full use. That's similar conceptually to fixing it. So if so, then we should be concerned about a person going to the mikvah as well. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the logic is here, because I'm not sure what problem there is with, shall we say, with fixing a person. The only possibility I came up with is that it might look like he's bathing for medicinal reasons, and we know that there are some limits on Shabbat and Yom Tov about doing things for medicinal purposes, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
He's a metaken, actually. The person is also a metaken. Before he was Tomei, now he's Tor. There's a metaken in there.
But there's a problem with being metaken a person?
That's what he said. It's the same thing with the Keli. Why not by a person?
Looks to be.
Okay, but by that logic...
Because the whole thing is near Kimasaken, right? So it appears that way.
No, but by that logic, am I allowed to learn on Yom Tov? I'm being metaken myself.
You're changing a status, right?
It looks like a key.
So you can make her.
All right.
Nice try.
So the Gemara answers.
So the Adam is a gezerah ata tikkun kli.
That's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says mipnei shenir'a ki mitaken kli, and then it says ihachi adam nami.
Because of the chashash of tikkun kli.
That's what I'm not sure about. It could be. I don't know for sure.
That's what it says here. Yeah, tikkun kli.
The form of repair to the individual.
Yeah.
All right. And the Gemara answers, Adam nira k'mekar. If a person goes, shall we say, swimming, it looks like he's just trying to cool himself off. It's not going to wind up being confused with mitaken. Hatenach maim yafim, maim ra'im ma'ika lememar. That explains. That would explain somebody going to a mikvah where the mikvah is clean. But what about where the mikvah is not so clean? People don't normally clean themselves off in mud. Cool themselves off in mud. There are times when it's incredibly hot and people wind up washing themselves to cool themselves off, even in water used to soak flax, which I haven't seen it personally, but as we know from elsewhere in the Gemara, it's apparently not very pleasant to be around. That explains that would explain being allowed to go to the mikvah during the summer. What about during the winter? Nobody needs to cool themselves off in the winter. Sometimes you're not necessarily trying to cool yourself off, but you are trying to clean yourself off. And that applies even in the winter. Tenach b'Shabbat. That explains why somebody is allowed to go to the mikvah on Shabbat. B'Yom HaKippurim ma'ikar memar. But what about Yom HaKippurim? You're not allowed to wash yourself off in order to cool yourself off on Yom HaKippurim. So why should you be allowed to go to the mikvah on Yom HaKippurim? You can't. Somebody seeing it won't say the person is trying to cool themselves off. Amar Rava, mi'ika midi di b'Shabbat shari uv'Yom HaKippurim asur. Now the answer is obviously yes, but Rashi says that the question of the Gemara is there anything that's forbidden on Shabbat because of miracha or because of some derivatives of miracha that's permitted on Yom HaKippurim? Rava says that since it's permitted on Shabbat, it's permitted also on Yom Kippurim, even though the reasoning that allowed us to permit it on Shabbat doesn't really apply on Yom Kippurim. Umi itle Rava hoil. Does Rava say that when we have a reason to permit something for part of the time, we also permit it the rest of the time, even when that reason doesn't apply? והתנן החושש בשיניו לא יגמע בהן את החומץ, אבל מטבל הוא כדרכו ואם נתרפא נתרפא. The Mishnah says that somebody who has a toothache is not allowed to, shall we say, gargle with vinegar, but he's allowed to season his food normally with vinegar, and if he cured himself by eating that food, so he got cured, no problem. This is part of the Gzerat Refuah on Shabbat, that you're not allowed to do things for medicinal purposes. And we said that there's a contradiction to that, because it says that you're not allowed to gargle and spit it out, but you are allowed to gargle and swallow. And Abaye says the Mishnah is referring to specifically when you gargle it and spit it out. Rava said something else. Afilu tema megamea uvolea lo kashya kan kodem tibul kan lachar tibul. And Rava said that even if the Mishnah is referring to when he gargles and swallows it, it could be that you're allowed to do that if you're allowed to do that if you're doing it before you ate your food with vinegar, because he might be just trying to stimulate his appetite by swallowing vinegar. But if he already ate, then it's obvious he doesn't need to stimulate his appetite, and it's obvious that he's swallowing vinegar for medicinal purposes. So to recap, Rava says that you are allowed to, according to the way Rava reads this Mishnah, you are allowed to gargle and swallow only before you eat, but because it looks like you might be using it as an appetizer or an appetite stimulant, whatever you want to call it, but not if it's after you ate, because then it's obvious you're doing it for medicinal reasons. And if Rava says that when we have a reason to permit something, we can permit it even when the reason for part of the time we can permit it even when the reason no longer applies, then he should have said about this Mishnah that you're allowed to gargle and swallow with vinegar even after you ate, because you were allowed to do it before you ate. V'im ita nema ho'il v'kodem tibul share le'achar tibul nami share. And the Gemara answers, Hadar be'Rava mehahi. Rava decided Rava retracted that. Umimai de mehahi hadarbe. How do we know that he retracted that? Dilma meha hadarbe. Maybe he retracted the statement where he said that you can go to mikvah even on Yom Kippurim. Lo sarkadatach. Tetanya kol chayvei tevilot tovlin kedarkan ben b'tisha b'av ben b'Yom Kippurim. That's he obviously wouldn't retract that, because it says in the BAYT that anyone who needs to go to mikvah can go to mikvah even on Tisha B'av or Yom Kippurim. So we see that, and Rav obviously can't contradict that. So he must have decided that the business about swallowing vinegar is permitted even after you ate. And he applies ho'il. He says that if you had something that was permitted for part of the time, and the reason no longer applies, it's still permitted for the rest of the time. So the Mishnah said, "V'shavin shemashakin et hamayim b'kli even." We said that you can touch previously drawn water to groundwater in a stone vessel. Remember, a stone vessel isn't mikvah tum'ah, but you can't put anything in a mikvah. Maya v'lo matbilin. What does the Gemara? Sorry, what does the Mishnah mean when it says you can't put a kli in a mikvah? Amar Shmuel, en matbilin et hakli al gav mimav letaharo b'yom tov. You're not allowed to take a pitcher or whatever that was tameh and say, "Oh, I'm just going to take the water in it and touch it to groundwater," and wind up by doing so making the kli tahor as well. Mane matnitin lo Rabbi v'lo Rabbanan. So who's the Mishnah going according to whom is the Mishnah going? It can't be Rabbi and it can't be Rabbanan. Detanya en matbilin et hakli al gabe mimav letaharo ואין משקין את המים בכלי אבן לטהרן, דברי רבי, והחכמים אומרים מטבילים כלי על גב מימיו לטהרו, ומשקין את המים בכלי אבן לטהרן. מני, אי רבי קשה השקה, אי רבנן קשה הקבלה. So we have a BAYT that says that according to Rabbi, you're not allowed to do this business of taking a kli and putting it in a mikvah as though you were just trying to touch its waters to groundwater, the water in it to groundwater, and you're also not allowed to take water in a non-tameh kli and touch the water in there to groundwater. And the Rabbanan say, the Chachamim say, you're allowed to do both, whereas the Mishnah prohibited one and permitted the other. So whether you say it's Rabbi or you say it's Rabbanan, there's a contradiction between the BAYT and the Mishnah. BAYT ema Rabbi, BAYT ema Rabbanan. BAYT ema Rabbi, Reisha de Braita b'Yom Tov v'Sefa b'Shabbat, v'chol ha'matnitin b'Yom Tov. So you could say it's Rabbi, and the beginning of the Braita that says you're not allowed to put a kli in a mikvah with the water in it. That's referring to Yom Tov, but the end refers to Shabbat. And in that case, Rabbi is saying you're allowed to do this business of touching water to groundwater on Shabbat, but not on Yom Tov. And the entire Mishnah refers to Yom Tov. V'BAYT ema Rabbanan v'chol ha'matnitin b'Shabbat. Or it could be that we're going according to the Rabbanan, and the entire Mishnah refers to Shabbat. And if so, the Rabbanan say that you're allowed to do this business of putting a kli in a mikvah because of the water in it on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, but not on Shabbat. Presumably, the difference between Yom Tov and Shabbat in this context is because of the gzera that you might come to carry it for Amot and Ushtar Rabbi. And we'll stop here. Is anyone saying Kaddish?
Wow.
Love to.